Morning, Gusita, thank you.
CICS 1 of 2022, Commission's own motion, 2022 statement in order pursuant to section 50A of the Act. The hearing is you.
Yes, I note there's no change in appearances at the bar table, other than we note that Mr Twomey is unable to appear before us this morning on behalf of WACOS. Firstly, can I thank the Minister, Mr Entrican, for providing to us a draft of a proposed supported wage system employee order. That's very helpful, thank you. And the spreadsheet of a list of awards to which that will have application. Is there any comment from any others at the bar table on those documents, particularly the draft order, that you wish to make? Mr Moss, from your point of view?
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. No comment. We believe that the proposed amendments that the Minister is proposing are in order.
Thank you. Dr Diamond?
No comment from Unions WA on the matter either.
All right, thank you very much for that. As you know, we're sitting this morning to hear further from the parties in relation to the Fair Work Commission's decision in relation to its annual wage review, which is handed down on Wednesday the 15th of June. So shall we keep to the same order of proceedings this morning, Mr Entring, unless that's a problem for you? Do you wish to go ahead?
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. On 15th of June, the expert panel of the Fair Work Commission delivered its decision in this year's annual wage review. The expert panel has determined the national minimum wage will increase by $40 per week. The national minimum wage will be $812.60 per week, or $21.38 per hour. The panel decided to increase modern award minimum wages by 4.6%, subject to a minimum increase for adult award classifications of $40 per week. In effect, modern award minimum wages above $869.60 per week will receive a 4.6% adjustment, while award wage rates below this amount will be adjusted by $40 per week. In most modern awards, the effect of the panel's decision will be that the 4.6% adjustment will cut in at around the C10 or trade level, and the flat $40 increase will apply to lower classifications. Employees working under National Modern Awards will therefore receive an increase of between 4.6% and 5.2%, depending on their classification. The expert panel deferred the increase for a small number of awards in the aviation, tourism and hospitality sectors until 1 October 2022, as those awards covered industries that were lagging in their recovery from the impacts of the COVID pandemic. Wage rates in all other modern awards will increase from the 1st of July 2022, as will the increase to the national minimum wage. The Minister notes the decision of the expert panel awarding an increase of $40 per week to employees on the national minimum wage and a lower award classifications, and an increase of 4.6% to higher award classifications. In proportionate terms, this is the highest increase since 2006, when the former Australian Fair Pay Commission awarded a $27.36 per week increase to all pay scales. That decision represented an increase of approximately 5.6% to what was then the federal minimum wage. The Minister notes the expert panel considered the most significant changes since last year's annual wage review have been the sharp rise in the cost of living and the strengthening of the labour market. The expert panel noted that rising inflation impacts on both businesses and workers, and that's a point the Minister also made in this year's state wage case. Rising inflation means the cost of business inputs increases, which, depending on the capacity to increase those costs or to pass on those costs, adversely impacts on profitability. Inflation also erodes the real value of workers' wages and reduces their living standards. The expert panel noted that low-paid workers are particularly vulnerable in the context of rising inflation, and highlighted the fact that non-discretionary components of the CPI have been rising by more than discretionary items. In fact, I note that the non-discretionary items had increased by 6.6% in year to 12-month ending terms, yes, correct. It was also noted that data from the Hilda survey shows that low-paid employee households were twice as likely to experience financial stress when compared to all employee households. The expert panel concluded that the requirement to take into account relative living standards and the needs of the low-paid supports an increase in the national minimum wage and modern award minimum wages. The expert panel noted the level of the minimum wage increase proposed by most employer groups would result in real wage reductions for award-reliant workers, many of whom are low paid. a number of the employer groups had argued for an increase of between 2.5% and 3%, while there were several groups that submitted there should be no increase at all. While the expert panel considered a larger increase than this was warranted, it also submitted that awarding an increase of the magnitude proposed by the ACTU and the Australian Catholic Council for Employment Relations, or ACER, in the present economic circumstances would pose a real risk of significant adverse effects to the national economy. The ACTU advocated for a 5.5% increase in the national minimum wage and all modern award wages, while ACER advocated for a 6.5% increase to the national minimum wage and a minimum 6.5% increase to the C13 to C10 rates in modern awards. So the expert panel observed that the increase it's determined provides a proportionately higher increase to low-paid workers, noting that the present circumstances warranted an approach which affords a greater level of support to these vulnerable employees. However, the panel also accepted the need for moderation in order to constrain the inflationary pressures arising from its decision. The 0.5% increase in the superannuation guarantee rate, the removal of the $450 a month threshold for receiving superannuation, and the 2022-23 federal budget relief measures were also moderating factors in its decision. In making the state wage order, the Commission is required to consider a number of statutory criteria in Section 50A(3) of the Industrial Relations Act. This includes consideration of relevant decisions of other industrial courts and tribunals. The expert panel's decision in the annual wage review is therefore a relevant consideration, amongst others, in these proceedings. The Minister acknowledges the expert panel was faced with a difficult task in this year's annual wage review, determining an appropriate wage increase for some 2 to 3 million Australian workers who are covered by its decision. While there was significant pressure to increase wages in response to rising cost of living pressures, this needed to be done in a prudent manner so as not to fuel further inflationary pressures. The Minister contends the expert panel made a considered decision in the circumstances, having appropriately balanced the various statutory criteria it was required to take account of. The Minister notes the expert panel has targeted its decision to provide the greatest relief to the lowest paid workers, while seeking not to create inflationary pressures. While a tiered increase such as that awarded by the expert panel is somewhat uncommon in national wage decisions, it was nonetheless an option that was available in the circumstances under the Fair Work Act. The expert panel did note that the approach it's adopted will result in some, albeit minor, compression of relativities in awards, but that consideration had to be balanced against the need to provide greater relief to low-paid workers in the context of rising cost of living pressures.
Yes, that approach was adopted by the Commission and Court session in 2017, where there was a flat dollar increase up to the C10 rate, and C10 and above, there was a percentage adjustment.
Indeed, Chief Commissioner, and in fact I was just going to mention that point. Yes, that's correct. The Minister notes that many of the key considerations impacting this year's annual wage review are also applicable at the state level. As is the case nationally, the West Australian economy has also displayed considerable resilience in recent times, with tight labour market conditions contributing to low unemployment, an acute shortage of workers and limited spare capacity in the labour market. As is also the case nationally, rising cost pressures are also affecting West Australian businesses and workers, with the low-paid workers particularly vulnerable to poverty and financial stress. The need to protect the interests of low-paid workers whilst not contributing to inflationary pressure is just as pertinent in the state jurisdiction as it is nationally. Given these similarities, the Minister would not oppose an outcome, tiered or otherwise, in this year's state wage case similar in nature to that awarded by the expert panel in the annual wage review. Should this approach be adopted, the Minister notes that resources are available through the Department and the Commission's website to assist with correctly adjusting payroll systems. As you mentioned, Chief Commissioner, In 2017, the state wage case decision, the Commission issued a similar form of tiered increase to the one just delivered by the expert panel. In that year's proceedings, the Commission awarded an increase of $16 per week to the state minimum wage and state award wages below the C10 level, and a 2.3% increase to award wages at the C10 level and above. The Minister notes the expert panel's decision does not specifically provide for a flat dollar increase up to the C10 classification. Rather, it provides for a 4.6% increase to rates of pay, with a caveat that all employees receive a minimum $40 a week wage rise. As noted earlier, the effect of this is that modern award minimum wage rates above $869.60 per week will receive a 4.6% adjustment, while award wages below this amount will be adjusted by $40 per week. It's also worth noting the amount of $869.60 per week does not align directly with the C10 classification. It cuts in part way between the C11 and C10 rate.
Yes, it's fairly close.
Fairly close, yes.
And I know
Correct.
in Western Australia, the C10 trades rate is considerably higher. The metal trade C10 trades rate is $917.30.
Oh, is that correct, Commissioner? I think the C10 in the state level might be a little bit lower.
According to the
than it
Metal
is.
Trades Award schedule, that's the rate
For
that's the
C10?
published rate, yes.
Oh, okay. That might include the tool allowance, possibly.
It does.
Ah, right. Yes.
Total
Very
rate.
good. The total rate. Yes. Yes. Correct. Regardless of the quantum, the Minister contends that any increase should apply to all employees from the first pay period on or after 1st of July 2022, in line with normal conventions. In earlier submissions, the Minister committed to keeping the Commission and other parties informed of developments concerning proclamation of the Industrial Relations Legislation Amendment Act 2021. The Minister is pleased to inform the Commission that proclamation for the commencement of the Act will be published in the Government Gazette today. In fact, I've been informed it's just been gazetted.
It has been, thank you. Yes, we have seen that, thank you.
With the Act to officially commence on Monday, the 20th of June. Commencement of the Act will then have several consequential impacts on this year's state wage order, being a requirement for the Commission to set a minimum wage for employees whose productive capacity has been assessed under the supported wage system as being reduced because of a disability, and a requirement to include an equal remuneration principle as part of the statement of principles to guide the use of a new head of power that will enable the Commission to make equal remuneration orders. At the request of the Commission, on 15th of June, the Minister supplied a draft form of words for use in the state wage order concerning a minimum wage for employees with a disability. The Department also supplied a draft list of those awards that contain a supported wage system clause, which specifically includes a minimum wage and will require adjusting as part of this year's state wage case. The Minister is happy to provide any further assistance the Commission requires on this issue. To ensure consistency with the new equal remuneration provisions of the Industrial Relations Act, the Minister also supplied a slightly revised equal remuneration principle for consideration as part of this year's state wage order.
Yes.
And the Minister understands that the other Section 50 parties are supportive of the revised principle, and the Minister thanks them for their cooperation. If it pleases the Commission and Court session, that concludes the Minister's submission.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Mr. Moss.
Thank you, Chief Commissioner. We'd note that in reaching its decision, the Fair Work Commission has had paid particular attention to cost of living increases and also the nature of the labour market. In our opinion, we believe that these two factors have dominated the Fair Work Commission's decision, and to a certain extent that may be to the expense of some of the other considerations. In considering the labour market, the Fair Work Commission identified that unemployment and underemployment rates are at historically low levels and that participation rates have improved. Now, we'd note that the most recent labour force data, which was released yesterday, identifies that WA's unemployment rate is currently 3.1%. That's marginally higher than the 2.9% recorded in April of this year. And that has largely arisen from an increase in the participation rate, which increased by 0.4 percentage points to 69.8%. In that respect, I think there's no doubts that the labour market is quite tight and at historically high levels.
Yes.
Having said that, though, what is a clear reminder of the ongoing impact of COVID-19, there were 3.4 million fewer working hours in May 2022 compared to April 2022. And that's largely a result of the increased absenteeism arising from the Omicron wave of COVID-19. So the effects of COVID-19 are still being felt, and particularly in Western Australia, where that impact has been delayed by several months compared to the East Coast. And we're still mindful of the fact that there is the potential concern or risk of future waves going forward, particularly now as we move into the traditional flu season too. In considering inflationary pressures, the Fair Work Commission has, in our opinion, given a disproportionate consideration to the March quarter data, despite noting that the high increase was driven by significant increases in the cost of new dwelling purchases, which the Fair Work Commission also do note later on in their decision were less likely to impact on those employees reliant on national minimum wage, an increase in the automotive fuel costs. And we note in our previous submissions that the federal government has sought to alleviate that pressure through the temporary reduction in fuel excise. We know that in his evidence that Mr Christmas cautioned against the over-reliance on one-quarter CPI figures, and we believe, therefore, that greater consideration should be given to underlying inflationary pressures as a better indication of the change of cost of living. In considering this, the Fair Work Commission raised that trim mean and weighted mean measures of CPI don't take into account the impact of irregular or temporary price changes to CPI. Our concern with that is that its solution of providing a substantially higher increase to the minimum wage fails to take into account that minimum wage increases are a permanent increase and therefore not an appropriate response to a temporary price movement. And we do reinforce that the minimum wage system forms part of the greater safety net, in which measures such as the tax transfer system can provide a more targeted response to temporary cost of living pressures, and such as the WA government's electricity credit and, of course, the federal government's temporary reduction in fuel excise. We therefore think it's more appropriate for this Commission to consider underlying inflation when judging the adequacy of the minimum wage. Turning back to tax transfers, the Fair Work Commission gave consideration to the increase to the lower middle income tax offset, and we believe, of course, it is appropriate for that to be consideration to. However, for the purpose of the state wage case decision, we believe the Commission Court session should also give consideration to the full range of both state and federal government initiatives to help offset the cost of living increases. So in particular, as I mentioned before, the credit for electricity subsidy, and also bearing in mind the reduction in fuel excise.
I think, as Dr Diamond observed in the main proceedings, there are also significant employer assistance packages as well, offered by Commonwealth and state governments. That's a relevant consideration, isn't it, as well?
No, for the purpose of the state wage case, we think less so, because those support packages were in direct response to the impact of COVID-19 measures implemented by the government, as distinct from cost of living pressures in that respect. So there's a difference in the purpose of those two things. So it's not noting, yes, there were some measures that were put into place that help offset that, but we don't think they're directly relevant to these proceedings.
Thank you.
The Fair Work Commission also gave some particular consideration to the risk of householders facing increases in their power bills, such as electricity and gas price increases. Now, we do note that with respect to WA, the state government has committed to keeping increases in household fees and charges below the rate of inflation, which will help reduce the cost of living pressures. And we do note that the concern with respect to increases, particularly in gas utility rates, is quite a significant issue, more so for people on the East Coast than it is as far as a pressure with respect to WA workers. As Mr Endrigan has previously noted, the Fair Work Commission did identify that a sharp rise in inflation impacts both businesses and workers, and that the cost of business inputs increase, or depends on the cost of business inputs increases, which depend on the capacity to pass on those costs, adversely impacts upon profitability, and of course noting that it also has a significant impact on the real value of workers' wages as well. Okay, it's a matter that impacts on both. We do note that in its decision, the Fair Work Commission has given significantly greater consideration to the vulnerability of the low paid than the challenges facing their employers. Now, what we would submit is that in considering the state wage case, there's a significant difference in the type of employers that we're talking about. For those employers who are most likely to be affected by the state wage case, they are by and large small or micro businesses, which are sole traders or partnerships. Small businesses are disproportionately affected by cost increases, as they have generally smaller profit margins and less capacity to influence prices compared to their larger counterparts. And I think we'd note that with the decline of enterprise bargaining at the federal system, the size of employers who are whose employees are more directly reliant on award increases has significantly increased in size and capacity. So I think that's an important distinction, that when we are looking at the capacity for employers in the WA state system to absorb those hikes, the capacity to do so is lesser. As noted in our submission of the 3rd of June, the ABS Business Conditions Survey found that 48% of businesses identified that they'd not increase prices, meaning that their increases would either need to be absorbed into profit margins or by reducing expenses. Our concern is that in the case of small businesses, substantial increase to wage costs are more likely to be absorbed by reducing working hours.
It's always difficult to tease out who's in and who's out, if I can put it that way, between the state and national systems, because not all small businesses are unincorporated. Many are. There's no definitive material that we have available to us that we can make an informed decision about that. Certainly, many might not be, but of course, a lot of businesses, and it depends upon the definition of a small business, what criterion you apply. Is it those with less than 15 employees, which used to be the definition for redundancy purposes, or is it some other measure? So there are some difficulties, I think, in grappling with that.
There are, but our experience has been, and whether one uses the small business definition of less than 15 or less than 20 using the ABS definition, our experience has been that it is very less likely that larger employers will be operating by means of a sole trader. In my experience, there's a small handful. I
think that's, I accept that. It's just that small business cohort that's the difficult one, because there is a mix of both, I suspect, incorporated and unincorporated, and there might be some line of demarcation between a small and medium business where that blurring may still occur as well. So it's a difficult one. It's a bit like a blancmange. Hard to get your hands on, I think, Mr. Moss.
I appreciate the analogy, and thanks for that. And I think is also clarified. There are lots of small businesses covered by the federal system as well, and that's not to be discounted. But there's also a lot of large employers covered by the federal system too, and of course, the proportionate is different. Our concern is that by reducing working hours as a way of absorbing costs, our concern is it really doesn't benefit anybody in that respect. It means less income for the employees, poorer customer service for the client, and then ultimately disadvantage to the business in way of lost clients, and typically the owners spending more time working in their business as well. Turning quickly to profits, we noticed that the Fair Work Commission's noted that gross operating profits have increased by 25.3% over the year to March 2022, and that's paragraph 33 of the decision. Part of that paragraph, though, is a table, which is important to note, Table 1, which identifies that this result has largely been skewed as a result of a 48% increase in mining profits compared to an 8.5% uplift in the non-mining sector. We also note that those statistics don't take into account business size. As we identified in our initial submission, the gross operating profits for unincorporated businesses have remained relatively subdued when compared to growth for incorporated businesses. It's also important to recognise the difference in the type of business affected by state wage case compared to the National Annual Wage Review. Particularly, as was mentioned before, with the shift in the number of larger employers who are underpinned by national modern awards as a result of that decline in enterprise bargaining nationally. In considering wage growth generally, the Fair Work Commission noted the increases in previous years have generally been higher than wage price index, and that this has not resulted in a substantial or in a wage breakout. And this is correct both at the state and national level. Both the federal and state wage case decisions have delivered higher increases than corresponding wage price index. And as identified in our initial submission, the state minimum wage has increased by 25.3% over the last 10 years, compared to 21.8% increase in state wage price index. Whilst there is a difference in the growth in the minimum wages and wages generally as measured by WPI, the difference between the 2022 annual wage review decision and national wage price index this year is disproportionately large, and we believe a significant departure from previous decisions. So whilst we accept there might be an argument for a higher differential this year based on wage price index not taking into account other forms of remuneration such as bonuses and the like, we don't believe it justifies such a significant uplift of essentially between 2.2 and 2.8% higher than wage price index, and that's whether we look at it as a 4.6 or a 5.2% increase applying through the federal decision. We therefore don't think it's possible to state that this year's increase won't have a disproportionate effect on wage outcomes generally, given how much higher it is than wage price index. The Fair Work Commission has again reinforced its view that moderate and regular increases in minimum wages do not result in a significant disemployment effect. However, we'd say that the increase granted by the Fair Work Commission this year can't be considered moderate. And as such, the view that it will not have a significant disemployment effect can't be made with confidence. The Fair Work Commission has also recognised at paragraph 161 that a substantial wage increase may reduce the capacity to employ the marginalised and hence impact on employment growth or add to inflationary pressures. We submit that the increase granted by the Fair Work Commission this year is a significant increase, and hence that risk is real. We do note that the Fair Work Commission has not appeared to have taken into account the international studies that were provided to it on the potential impact of minimum wage increases occurring in other jurisdictions, and has instead preferred the perspective of the Reserve Bank. That just reinforces the concern that we've raised previously with respect to the reliance on international studies as a proxy for what might occur within Australia. It should also be noted that in considering who is most affected by its decision, it's referenced analysis by the Australian government that low-paid work tends to be concentrated amongst younger workers, with over half of low-paid workers under the age of 30, 13.4% aged between 15 to 19 years, and 24.2% in the 20 to 24 year age cohort. This data does reinforce that low-paid workers are concentrated in young employees who are most likely to be working in low-skilled roles while studying, or as entry-level roles, which provides them with experience to move into higher-paying jobs going forward. And we think that this is particularly relevant in this year, given that the current labour market, such as it is, has given employees significantly greater capacity to move into higher paying roles or higher paying industries as a result of the substantial labour shortages. So there's a much greater opportunity for people this year and from projections going forward to move into better paying roles.
Just in terms of that issue, Mr. Moss, related, the tightness of the labour market, is it open to assume that there may be some level of over-award payments occurring in the marketplace? And if so, of course, a general order, as everyone knows, enables absorption of increases in the state minimum wage into over-award payments. So is that a relevant factor for us to consider?
I think the key relevant consideration for the Commission is more around whether or not the minimum wage is an adequate or fair minimum wage in that respect.
But I suppose one thing we do need to factor in is the impact on employers, the economic impact and their capacity to pay.
Yes.
That's a relevant factor to the capacity to pay, isn't it?
It is a relevant factor. So capacity to pay is an important factor in that respect. Some businesses will be in a position to be paying more than the award, and in doing so then gives them that competitive advantage to attract suitably skilled or experienced labour. A high increase that then removes the capacity for those employers to offer more, then also removes their capacity to use those higher payments in order to gain staff that might have higher efficiencies or productivity levels and the like. And I think from our perspective, it's an important element is increases to minimum wage can't or shouldn't seek to replace increases that might be negotiated either collectively or individually that take into account things like take into account productivity dividends in terms of, given my skill and experience, I can command a higher wage because there's a higher productivity attached to my ability to do that work. Increases to award rates can't take into account negotiations for productivity dividends.
Yes, thank you.
We do know that, as in previous years, the Fair Work Commission has recognised the impact of the upcoming increase to superannuation contributions, moving up to 10.5% this year, and that they've also taken into account the removal of $450 per month threshold, which will increase the number of employees who will be eligible for superannuation payments. And that removal of that threshold will disproportionately impact on younger employees who are more likely to be affected by this. So they'll have that greater benefit of the increased superannuation payments, but conversely, the employers will also have the additional costs associated with that as well. And we do believe that the state wage, as part of the state wage case decision, the Commission Court session should also give consideration to both of those factors. However, we don't agree with the view expressed by the Fair Work Commission that the full impact of the 0.5% increase should be considered on the basis that super provides a deferred benefit. Identify that paragraph 157. We believe this devalues the important role played by superannuation contributions. It also ignores the fact that whilst it provides a benefit to employees on their retirement, it's a cost that is incurred by the employer immediately. We can't defer that cost.
Yes, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, that one, isn't it? I mean, it is a deferred benefit to an employee. It doesn't help them pay for their groceries at the supermarket, but it does impose an immediate cost on the employer. So there's the impact is different on the employer versus the employee.
Yeah. I suppose the viewpoint as we'd make is the fact that you're not getting, as an employee, you're not getting that benefit until you retire doesn't mean it's worth less. Because it is still there and it is still there for you. It's just assigned for a different purpose.
Yes, thank you.
With respect to the economic outlook, we do note the national decision also highlights uncertainty over the state of the national economy. In particular, they do highlight that whilst the pre-election federal budget provided an optimistic assessment of the economic outlook, and they identify that paragraph 163, they also identified that the incoming federal government has identified that the economic conditions are particularly challenging, and that's paragraph 168 of their decision. We do note that the risks outlined by Mr Christmas in his evidence in these proceedings, which reinforced that ongoing positive economic conditions are not necessarily certain. In regards to the challenges faced by differing sectors, the Fair Work Commission concluded that a diversity of business experiences across the economy is not a new phenomenon, nor is it uncommon for businesses to experience changes in consumer behaviour and demand, and that the economy rarely moves as a cohesive unit. Our concern in that, with respect to what's been occurring this year and of course the last couple of years, is it fails to recognise that there are differences that are particularly telling in the current environment, with the additional forces at play in terms of the ongoing impact of COVID-19 and the changing impact of COVID-19, things like supply chain shortage and global instability. The challenges affecting different sectors of the community are, I think, more pronounced than they are generally speaking. In the case of WA, we believe the need to take into account the circumstances affecting or facing different sectors is greater, given the scope of industries most affected by this decision, and also the dominance of the mining sector in influencing WA's economic performance as a whole. The Fair Work Commission has also concluded that given the strength of the labour market and the relatively small number of employees paid at the national minimum wage rate, that they do not think that such an increase will have any material impact on the performance and competitiveness of the national economy. We're concerned with this view on the basis that it fails to take into account the impact that the increase may have on those businesses most impacted by the national wage case decision, but also, more importantly, the importance of those jobs for their workers as well. So we're concerned that the view is that if it has because of the small number of people who are actually covered by the national minimum wage at the federal level, that the view of that if those people are displaced, it's not going to have a significant impact on the national economy. Whilst that may well be quite true, that doesn't change the impact it has on the individuals themselves. We would also caution against this Commission adopting a similar view that because the state wage case applies to a relatively small proportion of WA private sector employees, that irrespective of the increase, it's unlikely to have a significant impact on the WA economy. We also note that the Fair Work Commission raised specific concern that the 5.5% increase sought by the ACTU would pose a real risk of significant adverse effects to the national economy. And whilst, of course, I'd note that the risk is significantly higher given Unions WA's proposal and WACOS's claims as well, we are probably more fundamentally concerned that with the Fair Work Commission view that an increase of between 4.6 and 5.2% does not also achieve the same effect. Turning to the timing of the increase, as Mr Therington has identified in this year's decision, the Fair Work Commission has chosen to delay the operation of the annual wage review increase to 1 October for a number of those industries most affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, which includes your hospitality sectors. We do note that this is one of the key industries affected by this decision, and it is our view that state system employers in both retail, hospitality and tourism sectors are experiencing fairly similar effects with respect to delayed recovery as a result of ongoing COVID-19 issues, both in terms of restrictions that we've had in the past, noting that there's always the potential that further restrictions may apply, and also increased transmission rates, which are affecting consumer behaviours. I note in particular retail as well, because in the state system, our view is that retailers covered by the state system tend to be small brick and mortar businesses, which are also affected by changes in consumer behaviours in a much greater way than larger retailers who have a strong online capacity in that respect, or are more likely to be selling staples where people need to purchase them at any rate. Now, taking into account the concerns that the Commission Court session raised last year regarding challenges associated with deferring state wage increases for specific industries, we're not seeking to have the state wage case decision deferred for any particular industry. So our view is that a first pay period effective 1 July would still be an appropriate decision. But we do believe that the Commission should give consideration to the effect of the delayed increase federally, in that it provides a reduction in the impact of the national decision. So in deferring the increase for the hospitality and other relevant sectors by 3 months, the $40 per week increase equates effectively to a $30 per week increase when you take into account the delay. Turning finally to the issue of tiered increases, we recognise that the Fair Work Commission has sought to provide a greater increase to those employees paid at or close to the minimum wage. And we do believe that a flat dollar increase is the best means for achieving this. We're not supportive this year of a percentage increase for the rates, say, above the C10 or appropriate equivalent. Our concern is that it actually applies greater inflationary pressure, because in those circumstances the increase will be higher than, in the case of the federal decision, the $40 increase that was granted. We believe that a percentage increase above the C10 doesn't take into account those skilled workers already have significantly greater capacity to negotiate remuneration based on their skill level, and therefore don't need to be protected in the same way. Okay, so our view is that a flat dollar increase applicable to all award classifications and the state minimum wage would be a more effective way of providing a greater benefit to the low paid, being those which are most in need of an increase to protect themselves from the cost of living pressures.
There is the issue, of course, of compression of relativities with an approach such as that.
Yes, and we do note that a percentage, and hence has always been the struggle between a flat dollar increase and percentage increase, because the percentage increase does have that impact on compressing relativities. Now, to a certain extent, those relativities have already been compressed by a significant period by which we did have flat dollar increases. So our view is that the compression of relativities is probably of a less significant factor, particularly this year, compared to helping to absorb the low paid from cost of living pressures. So we think the greater consideration should be given to those who are sitting, who do fit within that low paid definition, rather than maintaining award relativities, which are already skewed. But also, for the purpose of things like enterprise bargaining and the like, the relativities are well understood and well recognised. Our experience is the compression of the relativities for the purpose of awards doesn't necessarily flow through to compression of relativities in enterprise bargaining. So may it please the Commission and Court session, that's our comments with respect to the annual wage review.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moss. Dr. Diamond.
Thank you. And may it please the Commission in Court session. Unions WA's position in the state wage case remains unchanged as a result of the Fair Work panel decision in the national minimum wage case. We have asked and continue to ask for an increase of 7.6% to minimum and award wages. And to that end, we continue to request the WA Commission issue a general order pursuant to that amount. We argue that the Fair Work panel's reasoning in its national wage decision does demonstrate the need for such an increase in the WA context, and therefore the panel's approach is most consistent with the Unions WA claim, which was also the WACOS claim as well. However, there are some aspects of the national decision which Unions WA would like to address, particularly concerning, of course, the application of a tiered or hybrid increase to award rates, and also the decision to delay the operational date of the increase to certain awards and industries. Before I do that, though, we would like to make the point that the national decision does indicate the need for an increase that reflects the cost of living. The panel's pointed out that there's been a sharp rise in the cost of living since last year's review, and that inflation has been eroding the real value of workers' wages and reducing their living standards, and the low paid being particularly vulnerable in the context of rising inflation. The panel observed, of course, that the non-discretionary aspects of components of the CPI increased by 6.6% over the year to March quarter 2022. Those increased costs of non-discretionaries are, of course, such basic food food staples, I should say, that will particularly impact low-income households and many low-paid workers. Therefore, the panel, of course, concluded that changes in the economic context weigh in favour of an increase in the national minimum wage and modern award wages. It was conscious that the low-paid are particularly vulnerable, and given the sharp rise in the cost of living since last year's review, the increases awarded last year have resulted in a fall in the real value of the national minimum wage and modern award wages, and that was particularly highlighted in chart 10 of the decision. So while it may be the case, or it is the case, that the 5.2% increase is the largest since 2006, we would argue that it needed to be so in order to respond to these cost of living pressures. It is an increase that is consistent with a strong economy. The panel noted in its paragraphs 24, 25, 29 and 30 of its decision that the national accounts for the March quarter showed that gross domestic product grew by 3.3% over the year. Household consumption increased by 1.5% and 4% over the year, which did lead to a further decline in the household saving ratio. The labour market has indeed rebounded strongly from the impacts of the pandemic, and the unemployment and the underemployment rates are at their lowest for some time. And the most recent unemployment figures raised by Mr Moss also confirm that as well, noting that the WA underemployment rate is definitely at 5.5%, is below the national underemployment rate of 5.7%, which is itself very low. And with that in mind, the Commission noted that the number of unemployed people per vacancy is at its lowest level on record at since 1 to 6 or 1.6. The panel also noted, of course, the growth in job advertisements has been largely among the low-skilled, who will benefit most from an increase in the minimum wage and modern award wages. And with that in mind, we'd call the Commission's attention to the Unions WA initial submission, which made some similar points about the vacancy rates in WA as well. So with these aspects of the panel's decisions in mind, the WA minimum wage should respond to both cost of living pressures and economic performance, including the most recent CPI data for Perth or WA, which did come in at 7.6%. And that reality is reflected in the Unions WA claim and that of WACOS, which did provide the Commission with a quantified amount. However, I do want to draw the Commission's attention to the Fair Work Panel's discussion of economic indicators and forecasts by Treasury and the Reserve Bank, and noting their continuing revisions upwards. The Commission in court session may recall that Unions WA addressed this matter in its initial submission and in its questions to WA Treasury's David Christmas. We know that inflation is expected to rise significantly higher over the coming quarters, so the panel's announced increases could still amount to real wage falls, down the track for both minimum and award wages. The panel itself noted that the labour market's been particularly strong, and there's been a sharp rise in inflation, as we said, to which the low paid are particularly vulnerable. Unions WA notes that the Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe has recently said that he is predicting inflation to rise to 7% by the end of the year. Now, in its decision, the panel noted the marked difference between the RBA's inflation forecasts of 2020-21 and 2021-22. I guess I'd direct the Commission's attention to Table 5 within the decision, where they set out those differences, noting that that the RBA, that the RBA noted in its May 2022 statement that the outlook for inflation is also materially higher than envisioned 3 months ago. Headline inflation is now expected to peak at around 6% in the second half of this year, driven partially by higher petrol prices and sharp increases in the cost of new dwellings. And obviously trimmed mean inflation has been forecast upwards as well.
I think the RBA and Treasury have also forecast for into 2023 a moderation in inflation back to not within the target range, but not too far away from it. That was the expectation. Who knows what that will be, but if those forecasts are accurate, of course, the federal minimum wage and the state minimum wage will apply until next year's wage case in July 2023. So there's a bit of one and a bit of the other in the RBA's forecasting.
Oh, that is absolutely correct, Chief Commissioner. I guess we would also sort of perhaps draw your attention, of course, back to our initial submission as well, which made the point that a number of the forecasts in both the state budget and the Commonwealth budgets have actually been revised higher over the last sort of year or so, certainly between, say, the mid-year economic financial projection statements from December 2021 to the budget, of course, in May 2022. And the Fair Work Commission, or the Fair Work Panel, I should say, did certainly make that point that sort of a number of these forecasts have been consistently revised upwards. This seems to be sort of the approach that's being made at the moment. And with that in mind, real wage growth, wage price index minus CPI, tends to have been pushed backwards. That is the point that's made by the Fair Work Panel, and also the point that we're seeking to make as well. And with that in mind, while WA Treasury was forecasting a lower CPI for 2022-23 than the Federal Treasury, so that was 2.75 versus 3%. Perth, of course, already had that 7.6% result in March, higher than the national CPI of 5.1%. And we draw the, as we did previously, draw the attention of the Commission to the WACOS submission, which did make those points about household power disconnections and the need for assistance seeing a significant uptick. That was reflected the end of some of the moratoriums and the end of the $600 payment. To that end, the 7.6%, we would reiterate our point that it has a real world impact on low-income workers and households. And with that in mind, we think that the increases to minimum wages here in WA should reflect that. not least because the Fair Work decision itself also noted the impact of utility prices. I think on table 3 in its decision, the panel noted that low-paid employee households were more than twice as likely to report the financial stress indicators, such as not being able to pay electricity bills on time. I think the difference is between low-paid households 10%, all employee households 4.9%.
In terms of just comparing the Commonwealth and the state headline rates of 5.1 and 7.6, and accepting what you say about the impact of that inflationary figure affecting people in the real world, as it were, day by day, we do have to take into account, don't we, the electricity subindex and the effect of the payment made to households, 2020 and 21, which distorts quite significantly the actual headline rate.
We certainly don't propose that the Commission should ignore that.
It did seem to have quite an impact.
It had an impact, but also the impact of its temporary nature, the fact that it came back, also had an impact on low-income households as well. And with that in mind, we think that is something that the Commission should be taking into account too, given the sort of people, as has already been outlined, who are likely to be most impacted by the minimum wage. Our view is that, and I think we tried to put this in the initial sort of hearing as well, is that these do have a real world impact and they do need to be taken into account. The Commission may decide how much of an account obviously it wants to take into, but they were real increases and they had a real world effect, and they shouldn't be sort of simply shuffled aside as sort of a statistical blip, if I could put it like that.
Yes, thanks, Don.
Mm-hmm. So moving along to, so I've made the point about the increases, of course, to non-discretionary purchases, which are also sort of disproportionately impacted to low-wage workers. With that in mind, our view about non-wage benefits, such as credits, etc., for WA workers, while the $400 electricity credit recently announced by the state government to residential households is welcome, it's not a substitute, these and other things are not a substitute for the ongoing benefits provided by a real wage increase. We would reiterate our point that alleviation measures cannot replace wage gains because wage increases are compounded each year, whereas bill crediting is only temporary and leaves people vulnerable when those measures wind down. And so going to the point about assistance to households and assistance to business, which we raised in our submission, we would argue that yes, that's a distinction, but it shouldn't be regarded as a fundamental difference. Assistance to business is assistance to business. And if we're going to take into account something like an electricity credit, then those measures to business do need to be taken into account as well. Moving on to matters such as the significance of the increasing the superannuation guarantee rate. Certainly the panel said that it has taken into account the 0.5 percentage point increase in the SG rate and the removal of the threshold as well. However, they did go out of their way to make the point that they have not applied a direct quantifiable discount to the minimum wage increases based on that. And in that sense, the panel rejected submissions by employer groups, such as that advanced by the Australian Industry Group, in support of its proposed more modest wage increase of 2.5%. The Commission made the point that when the proposed 2.5% increase is considered alongside the 0.5 superannuation guarantee increase, it is basically not something that should be quantified in terms of the value of a particular measures or a means of justifying a lower increase. So while the Commission can take it into account, it shouldn't be sort of taken as a direct quantifiable figure. Similarly, quantifying the benefits of the lower and middle income tax offset, for example, as the equivalent of a 1.3% increase in pre-tax income, that is also apt to be misled as well, especially if there are comparatively few full-time employees that are paid the minimum wage. The benefit provided by the increase to the LMITO varies considerably depending on income and conceivably provide little or no benefit to many low-paid part-time employees. So our view is that while obviously we have a particular view about how the superannuation guarantee should be treated, we would urge attention to the point that the shouldn't be taken as a quantifiable or definite. If it goes up by this much, then you should pay this much less according to than what you otherwise might have done. But to reiterate, of course, the panel noted that it was conscious that the low paid are particularly vulnerable in the context of rising inflation as well. And the sharp rise of the cost of living, increases awarded last year would still resulted in a fall in the real value of the national minimum wage and modern award wages. So that should be considered when sort of considering any offsetting amounts. Concerning, of course, the growth in real wages, the annual growth, while annual growth did increase as inflation declined, real wages over the year to the June quarter 2021 fell by 0.21% as inflation picked up. And it was a much deeper and sustained fall. And they refer to a chart 9 in their submission, where I think it can be clearly seen that over the last year, there's been an extremely sharp decline in real wage price index growth. Now, the 2.5% increase awarded at last year's review decision exceeded the RBA's forecasts at the time for CPI growth and trim mean inflation. And had those forecasts been realised, the 2.5% increase would have resulted in a real wage increase. But the position has changed markedly. And as of the March quarter 2022, the headline CPI rate is 5.1% and the trim mean is 3.7%, and there has been a fall. So the panel concluded that the changes in economic context favour an increase in the national minimum wage. And we would argue that should be, those same considerations should apply to the state minimum wage. The RBA commented on the sources of inflation at the moment. Strong demand for durable goods and new dwellings enabled firms to pass on increases in input costs, and retailers in the RBA's liaison program, Reserve Bank I should say, liaison program have been more willing to accept price increases from their suppliers due to the broad-based cost increases that they have faced. Bearing in mind, the panel also paid attention to the living cost index, which is another index, of course, that the ABS produces. This index increased by 1.7% in the March quarter to be 3.8% higher over the year, which was the highest annual increase since the September quarter 2011. The information note published by the Commission staff prior to last year's review, or the panel staff rather than last year's review, explained the significant driver of the increases in the living cost index since the pandemic had been the fall in mortgage interest rates as a result of the RBA lowering the cash rate over that period. Now, mortgage interest is not considered in the calculation of the CPI, rather it is included as part of the living cost index, the LCI. This information note also noted that low-paid employees are less likely to own a home or currently paying off a mortgage. It will then be expected that any increases to the mortgage interest rate, as forecast by RBA, will lead to higher increases in the living cost index for employee households than the CPI as well. So therefore, In paragraphs 41 and 43 of the panel's decision, they point out that increases awarded in previous reviews have been above the aggregate wage price index growth for the last decade and have not resulted in a breakout of wages growth across the broader economy. In the meantime, the main contributions to an increase in inflation in the quarter included, as a point has been made, new dwelling purchases due to rising construction costs, automotive fuel, 11% driven by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So basically, CPI inflation has been going up and wages have not. So the sense in which kind of how much a wage price spiral we're entering into, we certainly don't have that at the moment. Now turning to some of the issues that we had about the structure of the panel's decision, the delayed increases to some awards. Now the panel said that it was satisfied that particular situations existed, such as warranted delays delays in the operative date for certain awards to the 1st of October 2022. Those were aviation, tourism, and the hospitality sectors. Now, it based some of these decisions on, or more to the point, it based some of these decisions on the rejection of the most recent reports by Professor Jeff Borland about the relative performances of these industries. Previously, it had used the reports of Professor Borland to make some distinctions about which industries were doing well, which industries were partially doing well.
Plus, as they were described at the time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. However, this year it has decided that it disagrees with Professor Borland's most recent report, particularly on the matter of accommodation and food services being allocated into the almost recovered section. They have, the Commission has included in its Table 9 some points about payroll jobs and also points about operating profits. However, if we are to consider employees more likely to be in the WA state system, now we point out that this does not appear to be a situation that is automatically applying in WA. The ABS monthly household spending indicator recently noted that WA had the third highest increase in household spending. And in Western Australia, among those top increases were for hotels, cafes and restaurants, which increased spending on which increased by 13%. We'd also call the Commission's attention to the Minister's initial submission to the state wage case, which included a table about employment by industry in WA. This noted that between 2020 and 2022, there'd been a 4.8% increase in employment in accommodation and food services. There was also a 6.7% increase in retail trade as well. And of course, there was an overall increase in industries by about 4.9%. The Minister also provided in its Table 4 information about, or the most recent information about gross operating surface and gross mixed income by industry.
Up to June last year.
Yes, which provided a note that there was an 8.9% increase and a 27.7% increase for accommodation and food services and retail trade respectively. So when the Section 50AB asked the Commission to consider the state of the economy in WA, and the capacity of employers as a whole to bear the costs, we would argue that the economic reasoning that the panel is using for delayed increases for certain industries doesn't consider the state of the economy in WA. And at any rate, delays in minimum and award wage increases will not meet the needs of low-paid workers, which of course is another consideration that needs to be taken into account, particularly as you will be, by delaying those increases, they're expecting the wages of those workers will definitely be going backwards, excuse me, in real terms between now and October the 1st. In connection to there being a tiered or hybrid increase, the panel said that, they decided to increase modern award wages by about 4.6%, subject to a minimum increase, the classifications of about $40 per week. There was going to, in effect, the modern award minimum rates above $869.60 per week will receive a 4.6%, and below they will be adjusted by $40 a week. And the panel accepted that the approach adopted will result in some, albeit minor, in their words, compression in relativities. They also acknowledged that increases determined will be in a real wage cut for some award-reliant employees, but they said that they would address this issue in subsequent reviews. Now, once again, in terms of the statutory criteria for the WA Commission to consider, meeting the needs of the low-paid and improving the living standards for employees, and also the need to ensure that the West Australian award framework represents a fair system for wages and conditions of employment. A tiered increase, or a hybrid increase, that results in both a compression of relativities and real wage cuts for some workers who are earning above the minimum wage, but are certainly not the biggest earners in the WA labour market, we argue would not be in keeping with that criteria. The ACTU pointed out in its national submissions on this particular issue that attempts to deliver hybrid increases may be insensitive to the very real prospect of hardship amongst those award-reliant workers at higher pay grades. Quite apart from legitimate concerns regarding the distortion of relativities, the selection of a departure point between the more beneficial versus the less beneficial increase is fraught and compromised by assumptions about living standards and the needs of those at higher pay grades. In addition, lower increases at skilled work rates would have a presumably unintended effect of dampening apprentice rates of pay and some junior rates of pay, notwithstanding that these workers are some of the lowest paid in the country. So, to conclude, of the increases proposed in this wage case, only the 7.6% proposed by Unions WA and also by WACOS will meet, we think, the range of statutory criteria that the WA Commission must consider for minimum and award wages. That concludes our submissions on this matter. We're happy to take any questions from the Commissioning Court session.
Thank you very much, Dr. White. We thank you all for your both written and oral submissions during the course of this state wage case decision. Now, having heard from you this morning, we'll formally reserve our decision in relation to the state wage order, and my associate will be in contact with the parties to let you know when we'll be in a position to deliver that decision, which we hope will be as soon as possible, given the timing. Thank you very much. We'll now adjourn.